to be a lot going on in the whole drug law reform movement at the moment. Countries such as Argentina and Mexico are surprising everybody by really getting rid of wholesale some of their drug laws. It's my belief that somewhere in the next 5 to 10 years, it substantially might be over the war on drugs. Do you think it's going to be like a Berlin Wall moment where all of a sudden some big thing happens, or do you think it's going to be a gradual incremental thing?
I would characterize it as a gradual incremental thing. There have been some, tectonic shifts recently, a function, I think, of the dismal global economy and also escalating fears of the kind and level of violence. So not only Mexico and Argentina, but Colombia have passed essentially decriminalization laws. Ecuador and Brazil are poised to do the same thing. And what's most promising to me is that our administration did not step in the way of that. So I think it's most auspicious, if you will, that we have countries around the world that are now beginning to take, in some cases, pretty significant steps toward drug reform that will actually create some more political cover for U.S. elected officials and perhaps even our president.
What's essentially the difference then between the communities in South America, where you would think there's a lot of interest, there's a lot of money getting made from the drugs, and the situation in America?
I think the violence above all has caused, for example, the parliament in Mexico and perhaps influenced the court in Argentina. You're really looking at low levels of use generally in those countries. Poor people don't have enough money to purchase these products from traffickers for the most part. We are the great demand organization, or excuse me, we are the great demand nation. And so I think it's safe to say that it is a concern about the violence. Innocent people are being killed. Children are being kidnapped. These are horrible forms of violence. So I think that's what's really motivating.
The American public is seeing this on their televisions every night, particularly with what's going on in Mexico.
Yes.
I was in El Paso actually a couple of years ago in Juarez. I don't think I'd go there now. Do you think that, the war on drugs came out of politicians trying to attract votes, when Nixon was dog whistling in the early 70s that you've spoken about? Do you think that gradually this fear-based thing of crime is not really working in terms of buying the public in America anymore? I mean, do you think the public are coming around more than the politicians and more than some of the institutions that are bigger the battle?
Absolutely. I really do believe that the public, that the people are out ahead of their politicians. I don't want to say that by way of giving, the false impression, at least in my judgment, that we're anywhere near the kind of reform that's necessary. I really do believe that that's going to be a long, drawn-out, incremental process. But it will be clearly speeded up if more and more people who feel the way we do about drug policy reform speak up. They need to raise their voices. They need to make some phone calls and write some letters and visit some offices and basically say, please, not in my name. This drug war has already done far more harm than good, and we need to stop it. So I think that will help accelerate it. But that's an educational process.
Do you think like gay marriage in America will be one state taking the lead first?
In all likelihood, one of the peculiar things about my country is that we have a federal government that trumps the state when it comes to drug enforcement. We have a lot of states in the country whose people have said, and these are also American citizens, not just residents of California or Montana or New Jersey, who've said, we want to decriminalize marijuana, or we want to make medicinal cannabis available to people who are suffering. And then we have a Supreme Court that has basically said clearly that those states that enact these initiatives are vulnerable. The federal government can still come in and shut down, for example, a medical marijuana facility, and they've done it. They can shut down a dispensary. They can take out every stick of furniture, not to mention the inventory in those places, any cash that's on hand. And so what's needed, obviously, is new law at the federal level that will grant back to the states, which originally had this power, the right to decide what regulatory system they would like.
And do you think that, I mean, America is increasingly, divided along, I guess you could say, evidence-based thinking on the one hand and faith-based thinking on the other. And, we see the Republican Party seemingly, some would say implode because they're so doggedly, determined to be, to sort of defend a culture rather than actual evidence-based things. Do you think that in your discussions with ordinary Americans and people in law enforcement that divide manifests in their opinions about decriminalizing drugs, or is it not really about that?
Oh, it absolutely does manifest. It absolutely does. And let's look at historical context for this. You don't fight a war without a vocabulary machine, a vocabulary, rhetoric, propaganda machine. And so a lot of people in my country, including men and women in blue who are policing America's cities, have grown up under that system of calculated education, which contains either well-meaning but fundamentally foolish statements or lies. And so if they've bought that, if they've accepted that, they're going to be a hard sell because, they've held on to that, what I would call faith-based, and what you've just called a faith-based assumption. Evidence-based work in the drug policy reform movement has never been more important. So every time any one of us says something in support of reform where we can cite a study, where we can identify good science that has led to incontrovertible conclusions about aspects of the drug war and drug policy, then we wind up, I think, with a much stronger argument, to be sure, but we also convince people who say, I never thought about it that way. This makes sense. If what we're doing is having the opposite effect of what we want, then maybe we need to rethink this whole thing.
But wouldn't it have rolled around by now if that was the case? Like, it's been 10, 15 years now where the evidence, the facts are overwhelmingly against the war on drugs. And yet, year after year, it keeps rolling out. We have the same situation here. It's difficult to find a human being who will stand there and tell you they support the war on drugs. And yet, it keeps going. The funding keeps coming to the police. As you've heard here, the policing against drug users getting more intense, more interventionist. Mm-hmm. And it's very hard for people to understand what are they. It's almost conspiratorial, where is it coming from? Yeah. This huge continuous support for the war on drugs.
It's not hard to find out where it's coming from. People will express themselves. They will profess their beliefs. I'll give you an example of that in just a moment, but you and I can agree that for the last 10 or 15 years, the evidence has been overwhelming, and I do. I say, how could anybody argue against this? And it's important to understand why people are arguing against it, and that is that the propaganda machine has not let up. The money is still being made available. The taxes are still being levied, and those funds being used to finance the drug war. So lots of people have a vested interest in the maintenance of that drug war. I just want to share with you a very recent example. I just read this morning. Two of our members, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, wrote an extraordinary letter. They sent it to the Washington Post. It was an op-ed piece, actually, and they laid it out. And it was so sensible. They were then subjected to an emotional attack from the president of the International Association of Chiefs of Police, saying, how could you in good conscience advocate the legalization of drugs when police officers have given their lives to this war on drugs? I'll paraphrase. How can you, when our children are at such great risk for exposure to drugs, advocate legalization? This is somebody who he's suffering from learned helplessness. He has consciously decided not to study the issues and to learn that we can make police officers safer.